I'm going to hit us with our title this morning, which is this. It'll be up on the screen. Kingdom Economics, Multiplying Our Present Abundance. Kingdom Economics, Multiplying Our Present Abundance. We're going to wrestle through the topic of economics. So get excited, everybody. We're going to talk numbers and economics this morning. And this is out of a place I know a lot of people have been asking questions about our economics as a church, because I know we've been facing some pretty unique challenges, and I know I've mentioned that on a Sunday. And so I know there's been a lot of people asking questions about that. But I will say this, in the meantime, I'm going to kind of celebrate, much like I do in our monthly council meeting with our church council, who stewards the finances. We got some things that we're celebrating. We've been kind of in a spending freeze for the rest of the year. Our incomes hasn't been as good as we anticipated it to be, so we've had to make some adjustments. But I just want to celebrate a few things just based on people's generosity over the past several weeks. So one thing, a couple of our church members actually sponsored the furniture needed for our new prayer space in the back. You might have noticed. Come on, somebody. So that was a vision and something that we wanted to get done this year. And then with the spending freeze, it was kind of a collateral, but we've had just generous hearts contribute to that. I want to acknowledge this. One of our council members offered to pay for the remainder of a fund that was freezing for our church. So they were like, I see the need, and I just want to help fund that need. So that was amazing. And then due to a plumbing leak, which is just like, you got to fix it, right, with our space, we were actually able to do a little mini renovation in the women's restroom at $0 material cost. Come on, somebody. So I know this is like classic in church buildings, is like, for whatever reason, the men's restroom always gets all the renovation love first. And so you've been suffering. Shout out to the women in our church family who've been suffering through the women's restroom. So you might have noticed it's getting a little bit of love, and it didn't cost us any money. So let's go. So here's my hope today. You will be as energized as I am when it comes to economics, because I am energized this morning. I'm excited about what we're going to get into. And I want to start us off with a quote that I kind of attributed to church leadership circles that I've heard before. And it's up on the screen for us. And it's this quote that methods change, but the mission stays the same. Anybody ever heard this quote before? Methods change, but the mission stays the same. Okay. So this is kind of this idea about how we do things. Yes, it changes, but the mission, especially for the church, our mission stays the same. So the way we do it oftentimes is the dynamic nature. And this is going to be really a message about economic methods, of some of the ways I think we can rethink and have an imagination for economics, especially when it comes to church. But I want to hit us with this in the beginning. What is our mission as a church, right? What is that for us before we even get into any of the conversation of the methods? So I think 3 quick scriptures that I think will help kind of help identify, like, where are we going as a church? What's our unique local kind of contribution? And the first I want us to look at is out of Luke chapter 9. I had you guys turn there. And so Luke 9, verses 10 through 11 say this. During Jesus' ministry, it says, when the apostles returned, they told Jesus everything they had done. Then he slipped quietly away with them toward the town of Bethsaida. But the crowds found out where he was going, and they followed him. He welcomed them and taught them about the kingdom of God. And this is where I really want to lean in. It says, and he healed those who were sick. This word healed and this word sick, like, there's an emphasis I want to acknowledge that I think is unique to us as a church family. But those are 2 interesting words, because the English word that's used as healed here is this Greek word, iamai, which means to make whole. And oftentimes this is a word that references salvation, the idea of salvation. And I love this idea that salvation is attributed to wholeness. And we think about it in terms of our English language as the word healing, right? And then that word that's used there in the Greek for sick is actually the word therapia, which you might have guessed by just the nature of the word and the way it sounds, is where we actually get our English word for therapy. So we have these words that are used in the Greek that are leaning into this idea of healing and wholeness. And this is where I want to lean into God's mission for the world, is this idea that a lot of Jesus's popularity, a lot of the draw, a lot of the crowds, a lot of the reasons of why Jesus was attractive while he was walking the earth has to do with this idea of healing. He led and was popularized by this idea of the attractiveness as a source for healing. as a source to lean into and follow, and saying, there's a degree of healing that I can experience by being in the presence of Jesus. And there was an accessibility, as he didn't turn away the crowds, but oftentimes, as we know this story goes on, he feeds them. He acknowledges them. He sees them, and he offers that to them. Second scripture I want to look at is Matthew 28, the classic Great Commission scripture, the church's mission. And here's what it says. We talk about this scripture a lot in our church. Jesus came and told his disciples, I have given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I've given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And there's this circular mission here that I think is really interesting to acknowledge of what Jesus is telling his church to do. And I like Jay, he acknowledged that as one of our council members. He just acknowledged it of like, we are to make disciples. We are to be disciple makers. Like Ford makes trucks, In-N-Out makes burgers. The churches, we make disciples. That's our mission, right? But there's this circular mission. This idea of that, like, make disciples who obey my command, to make disciples who obey my commands, to make disciples, right? So there's a circular effect to God's mission. And it's kind of interesting when it comes to the human condition, and as we acknowledge our own imperfections, that God's mission really empowers a community of what I would call wounded healers, right? That we acknowledge that we are people that are imperfect. We have a sense of woundedness, but we also equally have this sense of mission attached to it. That the church is this community where we're not arrogant to say we have something to give in the name of conquest, which is just very American, right? Conquest, let's go for it. But there's a humility that says, I'm wounded myself. I'm in need of ministry. I'm in need of healing. That's this weird dynamic, even as a lead pastor, is admitting like, okay, like there's a sense on the org chart where I'm like a leader, but hopefully you've experienced this from our team and from our leadership, is there's a sense of like, I need healing myself. I'm not above it. And so there's this beauty of giving and taking we experience as a church community, but there's this mission that we are wounded healers and we're a community of wounded healers in the Great Commission. And then lastly, Ephesians 1:23, which I think is the greatest vision statement for the church as Paul is writing to the churches in this region at the time. And he says this, the church is Christ's body in which he speaks and acts, by which he fills everything with his presence. It's the greatest summary of a vision for the church. That the church is the vehicle to fill everything in every way with God's presence. And in this idea of healing, and these Greek words we looked at the beginning, Jesus' vision is for God's healing presence to multiply. That's the vision he sees. How is that healing presence multiplied? And I'll just say this, is like not telling our church who it is in this season and being able to observe over the past 3 years since Callie and I were installed. I'll just say this, is what we've realized and what we've been able to identify is the idea of healing is a huge part of our unique identity as a church in this season. As a unique local church. I'll give us a few examples. The healing art of storytelling and the amount of storytellers that we have in this community. It's a powerful art that we believe in. It brings a degree of healing. And we have so many amazing storytellers that are creating healing for the world and offering stories that provide the empowered nature of healing and the art of storytelling as God invites us into his big story. And that art of storytelling is empowered to inspire, to offer healing, and to change people's lives. That's our church. That's Media City Church. God bringing us leaders within the world of compassionate studies. I love to brag on my wife for a number of reasons. One of the reasons I'm bragging on my wife a lot in this season is our co-pastor is a therapist. But we've also seen this degree of others within the realm of compassionate studies and practitioners be a part of our church in this season. And the last thing I would say, if I was just to condense a list, is there's also this gift of unique stories of our church being a refuge of those who have experienced horrific pain when it comes to church hurt and being burned by the church in the past. It's become a refuge. For whatever reason, by God's grace, the Lord has allowed those people to connect with this local church family. So with this healing mission in mind that's unique to us, we have to ask ourselves a question pertaining to economics. And that question is going to be up on the screen. How does the business of the church, which includes the economics, support the mission of God effectively? In our unique mission, we're identifying in the language of healing. How does the business of the church, including the economics, support that? And I'll just say this. I still believe the main metaphor for the church is family, not a business. I think that can change. I think in our American psyche, I think that can easily change. I still believe the greatest metaphor that we see throughout the scriptures is the church is a family. It functions like a family. But I will say this. Our view is that business is necessary. And it can be used as a tool. We just get into trouble where if the tool becomes our identity, right? So we view business as a tool that would hopefully reinforce our identity, right? So if we are leveraging business as a tool, I think it's a good question to go like, what kind of business is the church like? What kind of business is the church like if we are going to use it as a tool? And so I would say for us, we desire in the name of healing to be like a hospital, an ecosystem that supports healing. I'll say what we don't want to be like is like a black market pharmaceutical company where we offer what I would call church pharma, where it's not an ecosystem that supports healing, but it's an ecosystem that actually supports exploitation. And I think we can lean into that in our economic systems where we might be fooling ourselves that we're offering solutions that actually don't bring life change and transformation. Or what does the business model look like? What does the economic model look like for the church that actually helps support that mission of healing? Church economics matter. How do we spend money? What are we spending money on, right? Methods change, but the mission stays the same. So with a clearer understanding of our unique mission, what are our methods when it comes to money? So I want us first, this message is going to really be broken up into three main chunks. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. It's a trilogy. Which just reminds me, I was just talking to somebody a couple weeks ago about good trilogies and bad trilogies. So we'll see. Anyway, I want to really weigh in on this right now, but I'm not going to. Part 1. Okay, here's Part 1, which is us facing our methods in Part 1 here, which is the American church needs new money methods. We have to face stewarding God's resources. We have to face the ineffectiveness of American church methods in regards to money. Next up on the screen is a study that happened that keeps me up at night. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night as a pastor. A study that was done in 1999, which is well, that's a long time ago, but I would argue it happened in the midst of what would be described for America as the church growth movement, where churches were booming. When there was literature being published about methods of how we do church in America and the effectiveness of drawing crowds in a building on Sundays. Let's just say that. And here is this fascinating study that Gordon Conwell did. It says, according to Gordon Conwell's Center for Study of Global Christianity, World Christian Trends, less than 1% of Christian revenue is spent on evangelism, so sharing that healing in our language to the most unreached peoples. All costs of ministry divided by the number of baptisms per year. So baptism, this is a crass study, right? Like baptism, water baptism. Like we water baptize people as a church as a declaration of what God's doing inside people. So they're using this as a crass metric to go, is there transformation? The number of baptisms per year in India divided by all the costs in 1999 were approximately $9,800 per person. While the cost per baptism in the United States was about $1.5 million per person. $1.5 million per person. Now, once again, that's a very crass study, but what we could do, we really have an opportunity to just ignore that. Ignore the data. Ignore how it's going to impact our economics. Ignore it and say, well, business isn't spiritual. There are massive spiritual implications of the way we're thinking about economics in church and the way that we oftentimes convince ourselves in our nation, in our country, that more money means it's better. But there's an ineffectiveness I believe we have to face. We have a big need for new financial methods in the church, especially the church in America. So here are our three realities to kind of summarize my angst towards this and what keeps me up at night that I think we need to think about. And so these three realities will be up on the screen for us. And the first reality is this, is current church models are expensive. And a big part of them being expensive is we've thought about ministry when it comes to funding career ministers, but it also has a lot to do with real estate, and real estate being very, very expensive. We know this living in an area of the country where real estate is through the roof. We're just oftentimes feels like we're trying to get by in our current reality, right? With $1.5 million, here's just a practical analysis of this. Our method of helping share God's healing with the world's population can't cost more than the world's economy. Anybody, right? Like that's a bad strategy on paper. So we have to face this. And here's what I also will say is church planning doesn't need to be expensive in the way that we currently think about it. How are churches planted in the global South? They're planted a lot less expensively. This study kind of leaned into India as an example, right? But there's global movements and churches being planted in the healing presence of God, being experienced by other people for a lot less money, right? And one of our fascinations has been the idea of microchurches in America and how that's being expressed as very nimble expressions of church that cost a lot less money. So we as a leadership team have been leaning into this very heavily, trying to learn from the churches and the church movements that were growing during COVID rather than dying. Many churches were like, how do we do everything we do on Sunday in the building and all? But we leaned in and said, there's actually churches that thrived and grew during this time period. And those are the examples we've been trying to lean into as a leadership team as we think about economics. Second reality, economics are dynamic and disruptive. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is we had a writer's strike that impacted our church community uniquely that belabored the point that economies are dynamic and disruptive. And rather than as a church community be like, well, give more, give people. It's like, there's no capacity to give when people are out of work and out of jobs, right? So there's a fragility to how we think about that. I'll say this too, we had a pastoral transition in 2021 where Callie and I became the pastors of this church. And time again, you will realize that the data is in, whenever there is a pastoral transition, it creates a fragility in the economics. The data is there for us to look at. The moment Callie and I were installed, the moment a ton of generosity went right out the window for Media City Church. That's just the reality of a pastoral transition because it's disruptive. So it creates a fragility in the economic systems and who we are as a church. The last reality I want to hit on, which is just three of many, I think, is we shouldn't assume all ministry will have a financial kickback. During the glory days of the church growth movement, a lot of people planted churches during what was called the suburban boom, where it was like, we're going to plant a church in an area where population is growing and rising exponentially. I remember Phoenix being like one of these areas where it's like, that's where you plant a church. And people wanted to plant churches there because of our expensive model. They were like, there's a way for us to attract ourselves to a group of people where the population's rising, and the expectation is they'll become a part of our church and they'll be generous towards our church eventually. There was an assumption that there was going to be some sort of a financial kickback at some point that would help fund the way that we do church, the methods of how we do church. The problem is in our expensive models of ministry, we can't assume a kickback. Because how many of you guys know that there's so much ministry that we have to give to our community, to the world we live in, that we'll never get a financial kickback in return as we're servants, as we give out of our abundance. So there's a fragility to the way that we think about economy and the way that we express it in church and the way we're familiar with. And this matters. And so a lot of my thoughts and a lot of some of the things that I've been thinking about in this season, especially since Callie and I were installed as the pastors of Media City Church, have to do with church economics and our vision for church economics. And a lot of these ideas came from a book, and this will be up on the screen, called The Coming Revolution in Church Economics by a guy named Mark DeMoss. And his subtitle, I love this, Why Tithes and Offerings Are No Longer Enough and What You Can Do About It. There's a quote here And I highly recommend this book. I nerd out on this stuff because I'm a church leader. So if you're interested, yeah, do it. If not, it's like, well, I'm trying to help summarize some of this stuff for us, right? As we think about it. But I love this quote. He says, whether yet validated by your experience or not, churches will become more reliant on multiple streams of income in the future and soon need to leverage their assets in order to generate a financial return on investment, or an ROI, as it's often described in business terms. Right? Let me remind us, too, that the average church in America is about 50 people. We oftentimes use great examples to go, why would we need to rethink any of this? Yes, there's a small fraction of churches that their economics are not being disrupted. For everybody else, which actually represents the majority of churches and people that need to be cared for in America, we're having to rethink the way we think about these economic realities. We fall into that category. How are we thinking about it? What is our vision for economics? How do we fund the healing mission of God towards our community, towards our world, and towards us as well, as we need to be recipients? Here's one of our unique challenges, since Callie and I have been installed as the co-lead pastors. In 2021, so we were installed about halfway through 2021, our income was about $700,000 as a church. This year, our projected income is about $365,000. So we have transitioned over the past several years from having an income and the ingredients that, once again, disrupted all of that. That's up for grabs and trying to interpret. But the reality is we went from $700,000 to about half of that as projected for the end of this year. But here's the big truth that'll be up on the screen that I think we need to wrestle with as well. Big truth. More money does not mean we are being more effective. Let me say that again. More money does not mean we are being more effective. This is my passion for this message that I submit to your feet today. Despite a transition where we're seeing less, our economics are actually moving in the right direction, I believe, to support God's mission in the world. The American church test. This is the test, I think, for all of us as church leaders of churches like ours. How do we actually accomplish God's mission with less money? Or said another way, how do we multiply ministry with an awareness of our present abundance? Less money does not mean we are at a lack. And some of you might be going like, holy crap, oh my gosh, that is a lot less money. Several $100,000. And I would say, no, there's good news in the midst of all this. We're moving in the right direction. Year to year, this past year, we have less givers, the number of givers, with increased overall generosity. And that's a big win. Because what's showing is we have a group, a foundation of people that are leaning in and growing in generosity more and more. These are the good things that we see in our abundance and the possibility and the potential that we have. And it reinforces, I think, a bigger mindset for us as a church is that we have everything we need to see God's mission multiply. We have everything we need, which is Psalm 24, right? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. It's this acknowledgement that, like, it's God's. And we have everything we need. We actually have an abundance at our disposal. And it's a matter of us unveiling that abundance and leaning into that abundance to continue to fund the things that God is up to in, through, and beyond our local church. So let's get to part two. Who's ready for the economic vision here? Part two. Anybody? Okay, good. Part two. Here we go. Yeah, come on. Our economic vision. And so I would say that our economic vision, and this is something I presented to our council years ago, and we've been looking at, again, reinforced this past meeting of going like, hey, let's look at this again. Let's see how we're doing. We express it through what I would call 5 pools of resource abundance. 5 pools of resource abundance. So we're going to walk through all 5 of those. So you get kind of an idea of what is our economic vision addressing some of these realities that we've addressed in terms of especially the American church. So first abundant resource pool is pool number 1, which is the classic one. It's what we would call the tithes and offerings pool, which is all about internal generosity. The pool of generosity that exists when it comes to the generosity of us as a local church. And so the question on this one we ask is, how will we use the church's generosity to support and express God's mission of healing? And so if I was to attach kind of a vision to that as we move forward, it would be this, is leveraging our current and familiar economic model, which has a lot to do with staff, funding staff roles on our team, career pastors currently, and then the space that we do have this space at our disposal. How do we leverage that? How do we leverage what's current and what's familiar to then plant more churches less expensively, where we're not reproducing the same economic model that has a ton of fragility and it doesn't make any practical sense, right? So I will say this, I want to attach some early wins to these things because these are once again, these are future forward of like, let's see that happen, we can see it. But I also want to celebrate some early wins that are attached to all these things. So as I mentioned earlier, we have been exploring less expensive church models, specifically when it comes to the idea of microchurch it thrived during COVID. When things were disruptive, there was outliers where things were growing rather than ceasing back, right? And using these tools to plant more churches with more money. So we as a church staff this year, we went to what was called the Microchurch Conference that was in Kansas City with a bunch of like-minded leaders that are in this space. And we as people that are a part of this familiar model said, how do we envelop ourselves, our leadership, our mentality into models that are less expensive as we think forward in the contribution we're going to make as a local church? Because we are stewarding God's resources. So we want to lean into that reality. And so we're already seeing some early wins because we've been saturating ourselves with leaders and thought leaders that are thinking about church differently. Because once again, the mission stays the same, but the methods change. What are other methods that are out there? And what are these early wins that we're even seeing in an American context and the way these things are being expressed, not just overseas? So we're celebrating that. So that's abundant resource pool number one. Let's get into the next one, which we're calling number two, which is this pool that we would call a donor-based pool, which is all about external generosity. So the pool, let's say, of people outside of our church that might be funding the mission and the ministry of what we're doing inside the church, right? Individuals and organizations that will never be a part of the life of our church, but see value and contribute towards the value of what our church is doing, right? So our question that we would ask on this one is, what is our increased value of healing to the community? Do we offer that? Do we carry a reputation to the wider community and people at large that we act as an operation of healing in conjunction with the community? Now, I would say out of all these different pools, this is the one that we have devoted the least amount of energy into the expansive nature of like how we could explore this further. Now we have vision for this and we've been talking about this, but I would just say like on a scale of like, where's the energy going? This is the one that's been the least explored, right? But I would just say this too, like this happens kind of organically. Like when we offer, this happened like within the past couple of years, we hosted a memorial for a family. And in return of this wasn't a person that had anything to do with our church. And just by the way, the nature of hosting a memorial for this family, they gave our church a very generous donation as just a thank you. So it's like, that's a small example of what we're talking about here is when we offer healing and opportunity for a community or even families or networks of relationship, that sometimes in return, that value of ministry we're offering gets funded externally, right? And so a vision, one of the visions that we have to express this, which is up there, is a hub for low-cost therapy options and sponsorship opportunities. One of the things that we've realized is there's not much equity when it comes to accessibility when it comes to therapy options and the opportunity for people to get the mental health care that they need. I, as many of you know, began to engage in therapy for the first time in my life about a year ago. It has literally, I would say, saved my life in terms of my therapist and the relationship that we've had, in terms of everything that I've experienced in my life over this past season, right? But the problem is sometimes there's such an equity issue concerning the care that people need that I think we as a church have an opportunity in the name of healing to step in creatively to think about ways that we can offer those types of resources for lower costs. So early win. I want to celebrate an early win. We are now partnering with Emmaus Road Counseling, a counseling center, Christian counseling center for lower cost options. So that's happening. We have therapists that are currently kind of assigned, but we're expanding this. This is one of the things that your co-pastor is leaning into and trying to figure out how do we facilitate this and see more of this expand in terms of our vision when it comes to our resource pools. So we're celebrating that. Third, let's keep going. Abundant resource pool number 3. All right. And this is what we would call the co-vocational pool, Or how do we fund staff creatively? So the question here is, how can we liberate the cash costs of full-time staff through aggregate resources and or roles that in turn complement and expand the healing ministry of Jesus? Many of you might know this, probably most of you don't. On top of this main church property, our church is responsible for 4 separate properties that are more residential. So we have quite a bit of opportunity. Those parsonages have traditionally been used to think about how do we offset living costs and offer housing to our staff members. So we've had a vision for this historically as a church, but we're also thinking about this in terms of how does that expand in terms of the idea of co-vocation. So many people are familiar with the idea of bivocational, but co-vocational assumes how do we have adjacent funding through career that liberates the church's costs towards a pastor or a person on staff that aggregates the cost where you have part-time work for the church and part-time work in the community, but those things feed one another rather than work against one another. Now, the vision for this is very contextual, I think, to us, which is, I put there, not losing paid staff members because of practical costs associated with progressive life milestones like marriage, children. Historically, as our most recent history, we were having kind of like this expression where it was like we had kind of leaders that had a lot of ministry experience being expressed in our church, and then we had a lot of young leaders that were new. The problem is when those young leaders began to continue to move on with their life, every time somebody got married, we had to say bye-bye to those staff members, right? Because we couldn't afford to keep their leadership here. That's the practical nature. So there's a lot of expansiveness that we can think about in terms of co-vocational and how that could potentially be expressed. But I'll just say this. Here's one of our early wins that I'm celebrating for our church as we've thought about this, is Bella and Donai, who are current church staff members, were married 2.5 years ago and are still on our staff team today. Come on. That's a big win. Because that hasn't happened in a while. I'm just going to be honest. That's a fragility. Anytime we say, hey, we're going to have family business, everybody's like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, that literally is one of the things that, like, is a part of the reality of who we are. But here we know, like, we have transitioned from all full-time people. Donai, who's our worship director, his role is no longer full-time, it's part-time. He's pursuing a career in education. Shout out to him in the back. Callie, your co-pastor, has continued to pursue how her aggregate career in therapy can help alleviate us as a church moving forward. But this goes for all of us and how we're thinking about how do staff roles get funded and how do we liberate the costs and the expensive costs when it comes to a full-time expression. Full-time or nothing is sometimes the way that I express it and talk about it. All right, so we got some early wins. That's exciting. Abundant resource pool number 4, which is the pool that we call ministry or nonprofit partnership pool, which I put there, leveraging our assets in ministry. I mentioned that we have this massive property that we steward, but we also have 4 other kind of unique residential type properties that we have to steward as well. So the question here is, how can we use our space for more of the healing ministry of Jesus to happen? So our vision for this pool is our properties being used as hubs and incubators for more and more ministry to happen. There is a property in particular right now we are praying through as a council that we've been thinking about of like, how do we potentially leverage this as a hub for more ministry to the community? But we're also balancing all these different pools to go, what can we afford right now? What's the right decision to make? So pray alongside us as a council as we make these decisions, because we have a lot of exciting vision for what could potentially take place, but we also know there's a sequencing of stewardship to all this stuff, right? And so we're balancing and we're working and processing through that as a council right now. So I'll say this, our early win in the way that we've expressed this pool is, many of you know this, we help sponsor Unique Life Church to self-sustainability, an Armenian church that was incubated within this church property that now meets in Highland Park and has a building of their own. So we did that. We helped sponsor them. And we currently rent to several ministry partners. In particular, many of you might have noticed, there's a Ghanaian church that meets in the afternoons now in this space. We also have a unique kind of men's Russian Bible study that we're building a relationship with that meets in here on Thursday nights. So this, as we've used this in the past, we are continuing to think of how do we continue to expand that more and more by leveraging our space for more ministry of the future. And these people are renters who are saying, we need a space, and how do we collaborate together with the beauty of the space? And how many know this? Church real estate is some of the most underutilized property during the week or on the calendar. So how do we leverage that more and more for more ministry to happen? And then lastly, the last abundant resource pool, number 5, this is what we would call the for-profit partnership pool. So how do we leverage our assets as ministry? So in examples, or the question here is, how can we position our space to be a blessing or a healing presence for others? So some examples of that are parking lot rentals, film shoots. Many of you know John Rittner is a part of our teaching team. One of the things that John has helped us with is explore this idea of how do we leverage our space creatively to be a blessing for our communities, particularly with storytelling. Traditional real estate listing. So our vision here, our properties being leveraged as a source of income and a solution to needs in our community. One of the unique feedbacks that we've gotten as we've engaged the film industry and location scouts is their gratitude for just being really hospitable hosts when it comes to people's presence coming on here for a film shoot, of us just knowing like, we don't know any different, but people have been like, thank you so much for being so kind to us. And we're like, we didn't realize that was going to be a ministry opportunity, just being present hosts, but we're realizing relationship is continuing to pick up now that we're this much past the writer's strike, right? And we're seeing more and more of these relationships being developed and with film productions and companies, which is really, really excited. So I put it here as an early win. We are seeing consistency in film production relationships and their gratitude for our hospitality towards location scouts and crews. All right. So with all those pools being acknowledged right now, if we're going to look at this past year's income, here's where we're at with all of that. The pools that don't represent our church's generosity, so that first pool, internal only, all those other pools currently now make up about 30% of our church's income. 30%, which is a huge chunk. I will say this, our last council meeting was several weeks ago. We always get a peek ahead into our budget, or a peek ahead at our balance sheet for the following month, and our profit and loss. And at the point where it was peaking ahead at that point, and what we were looking at, our secondary sources of income, all those other pools, were actually outpacing our internal generosity. It's amazing. Amazing opportunity for us to think about. But also, I would say, a nudge for us as the church community as we lean into part 3, which I'm calling our application, which leans into my personal belief. The generosity of Jesus' church is always and will always be the greatest opportunity for economic abundance. We are followers of the most generous person to ever live, Jesus himself. So I think this creates such an opportunity, an acknowledgement of the abundance that we have in Jesus as a Jesus-following community. And so, this is where I want to get really practical, which is an envelope that was placed on every chair, because we're calling this month our month of giving. This is our monthly rhythm, the month of November, for us as a community to lean into wisdom, to say, hey, we got a budget we need to prepare for and create for the following year. So we as a council want to work with the most accurate data. There's dynamic, there's disruptions, we know that, we've acknowledged that. But we as a church council also want to create opportunity for us as the people of God to grow in generosity, especially when our unique church family, and for us to go into this next year with an opportunity and some data, so to speak, for us to prepare wisely as we create a budget. That budget, over the past several years since Callie and I become the pastors, has gotten more and more accurate as we've wrestled through our unique challenges and circumstances, right? So, in a few Sundays, November 24th, we're going to be having a special offering that's represented by this envelope. So it reinforces our goal together. And here's what I want to acknowledge. If you consider MCC your church family, if you do not yet, we would say, okay, keep hanging out with us. Keep being a part of our church. But if you do consider this church as your church family, I think it's good for us to acknowledge what kind of generous people do we want to be. And I think the language that I keep coming back to in terms of us growing in our generosity as the people of God is we want to be sacrificial givers, but we also want to be faithful givers. And so I just want to acknowledge that as our goal in growing and being generous as the people of God, and specifically when it comes to Media City Church. Because I know this, sacrificial giving is hard. Because in our American psyche, we believe this lie that says if we just had more, we would be more generous, right? If I just had more of a surplus, that would allow me to be more generous. But it's interesting because Jesus highlights in 2 of his Gospels sacrificial generosity. There's a widow who doesn't give out of her abundance, but there's a widow who has barely anything and she gives it to the temple. And Jesus says that's the type of sacrificial generosity that I want to elevate. Is when we become people that don't just give out of the abundance that we have, but when we give and there's sacrifice and there's something that we're sacrificing for us as we're helping fund the mission of God. So giving sacrificially is a part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So we as a church, we want to encourage that. What does it mean to give more sacrificially? The second thing is faithfulness, right? Faithfulness. It's interesting because Jesus reminds us that a daily part of our lives is sacrifice. So it's not just like this once in a while thing. It's like, he's like, carry your cross daily, right? This daily sacrifice, this Romans 12 worship, that's not something on a stage, but it's literally a lifestyle of worship where we're sacrificially growing more frequently into what it looks like to be faithful. I love that faithfulness is a fruit of the Spirit in the scripture. What it means to lean into the supernatural capacity of Jesus in our character and to grow more and more faithful. What does it look like for us as followers of Jesus to give more sacrificially and to give more faithfully? So that's what Giving Sunday creates, an annual opportunity for us to do as a church. What does that look like for us? I'll say this too. Science now has proven that generosity is linked to a person's overall happiness, which is crazy, right? It reiterates what Jesus said, it's better to give than to receive. And our brains are actually wired to be generous people. So generosity actually provides literal healing for our mental health when we engage in that posture of generosity. So very practically, I just want to walk us through as we're thinking about economics, as we're thinking about this first abundant pool, which is the internal generosity of our church, what is created by this opportunity for us to pray through over the next couple of weeks when it comes to this envelope right here. So there's 3 options on there. Number 1 is our 3-month generosity challenge, which I know we've talked about numerous times, which is a way to go, giving sacrificially and faithfully is going to be really, really hard. And it gives us an opportunity to say, we want to partner with you in that step of faith in saying, hey, for 3 months, give, and let's see what happens. And if for whatever reason, the dynamics of economics, like we mentioned before, and the fragility of all that goes haywire, hey, we will give you your money back. But it's a way for us to partner with you, to hold this posture with you and say, let's trust God and see what happens, right? So that would be step 1. And included in this envelope is that 3-month generosity challenge, everything you need to know about that as a potential step if you consider this your church family. Number 2 is option 2, a new commitment to give sacrificially and faithfully by becoming a regular giver. If you consider this church family your home, what does it look like for you to make that commitment and say, I'm going to become a regular giver? I'm going to give sacrificially and faithfully moving forward. What does that look like for you? One of the classic ways that the church has expressed this is through the language of the tithe, which I remember I didn't learn until I was in Bible college because I wasn't really a church kid growing up. It's like, what is a tithe? Tithe literally just means 10%. And so historically, it's a great tool to keep in your life as a way to hold yourself accountable to be sacrificial in your giving and faithful in your giving. It's taking 10% of your income and offering it to the Lord as a first fruit, so to speak. The first thing in our budget becomes this 10%. And I'll say this, is it's a great tool for us to be held accountable to give towards the mission of God together. But I'll also say this, is that our church, we are tithers collectively, meaning this, we have a denomination and everything that comes in for our general fund, we take 10% of and give it to our denomination. So we collectively are faithful tithers. And I just want to acknowledge that because when we give 10% to our denomination, we are giving indirectly to ministry arms that exist in 150 countries all over the world. So we're helping indirectly support missionaries that exist in 150 countries. We also are indirectly impacting, when you give, ministries that support disaster relief. We've been flooded with disasters globally all over the world. So when we give out of our 10%, in our faithfulness, as a church collectively, we are helping support a lot of disaster relief that's going on all over the world. And the people that are on the ground to help fund them to aid that. So this is a part of, even as a church, we want to be collectively built into our rhythm to be tithers ourselves, which I think is, once again, a great tool for us to be accountable to make sure at least 10% of what's coming in, we give away. And we give away sacrificially. And there's a sense of trust that comes with that as well. Option number 3. Maybe you're a person that already gives regularly. So Callie and I, we tithe to our church. We take 10% of our income. So that's kind of one of the ways that we regularly express it as a tool. So the option 3, if you already are doing that and you are giving sacrificially, this is an opportunity, I think, annually to go, what would it look like to give a above and beyond gift? Praying about, hey, this is a moment that we're going to challenge ourselves sacrificially and faithfully in our generosity to increase and go, what would it look like to give a one-time gift? And I know many of you have already expressed that since we've announced our spending freeze, and we've seen that fruit. But I think it's good for us to build that into our rhythm. If we are regularly giving, what does it look like to always pray and have these rhythms to go, hey, I want to pray about this and see if the Lord's encouraging me to give above and beyond in a unique way. All of this, church economics, it's about multiplying our present abundance. And we have so much abundance as Media City Church, but it's helping support us more and more as we become better and better stewards, as we give sacrificially and faithfully to help support this unique mission of healing that we know God is in and up to in this season. Amen? So as we conclude, we're going to reflect and just encourage you, take this home, pray over it, lean into this. Ask maybe the Lord what he would be doing in you as we lean into what it means to grow in our generosity, but also what it means for us to wisely prepare a budget for next year and continue to see the work of God reform and flow through the economics of our church as we're good stewards and called to be good stewards. So we're going to reflect, and we're going to reflect like we normally do, which is through a couple questions that'll be up on the screen. During this time, what did you feel the Holy Spirit was speaking to you during the message, and what are you going to do about it? And we oftentimes express that through an I will statement as we lean into what it might look like to obey the things that God's working on in our hearts. So let me pray over us as we lean into that moment together this morning.